The desert. The desert to Jean Grenier. Living, of course, is rather the opposite of expressing. If I am to believe the great Tuscan masters, it means bearing triple witness in silence, fire, and immobility. It takes a long time to realize that one can encounter the faces in these Tuscan paintings any day of the week in the streets of Florence or Pisa. But of course we no longer know how to see the real faces of those around us. We no longer look at our contemporaries, eager only for those points of reference in them that determine our behavior. We prefer its most vulgar poetry to the face itself. As for Giotto and Piero della Francesca, they are perfectly aware that a man's feelings are nothing. Surely everyone has a heart. But the great simple, eternal emotions around which the love of living revolves, hatred, love, tears, and joys, these grow deep inside a man and mold the visage of his destiny, like the grief that makes Mary clench her teeth in Giottino's Entombment. In the immense friezes of Tuscan churches, I make out crowds of angels, their features scarcely traced. But in each mute and passionate face, I recognize a solitude. What matters are not picturesque qualities, episodes, shades of color, or emotional effects. What counts is not poetry. What counts is truth. And I call truth anything that continues. There is a subtle lesson in thinking that in this respect, only painters can satisfy our hunger. This is because they have the privilege of making themselves novelists of the body, because they work in that magnificent and trivial matter called the present, and the present always shows itself in a gesture. They do not paint a smile, a fleeting moment of modesty, of regret, or of expectation, but a face with the shape of its bones and the warmth of its blood. What they have expelled from these faces, molded for eternity, is the curse of the mind, at the price of hope. For the body knows nothing of hope. All it knows is the beating of its own heart. Its eternity consists of indifference, as in The Scourging of Christ by Piero della Francesca, where, in a freshly washed courtyard, both the tortured Christ and the thick-set executioner reveal the same detachment in their attitudes. This is because the torment has no sequel. Its lesson ends with the frame around the canvas. Why should a man who expects no tomorrow feel emotion? The impassiveness and the greatness that man shows when he has no hope, the eternal present, is precisely what perceptive theologians have called hell. And hell, as everyone knows, also consists of bodily suffering. The Tuscan painters stop at the body and not at its destiny. There are no prophetic paintings, and it is not in museums that we must seek reasons to hope. The immortality of the soul, it is true, engrosses many noble minds. But this is because they reject the body, the only truth that is given them, before using up its strength. For the body presents no problems, or at least they know the only solution it proposes, a truth which must perish, and which thus acquires a bitterness and nobility they dare not contemplate directly. Noble minds would rather have poetry than the body, for poetry concerns the soul. Clearly, I am playing on words. But it is also clear that all I wish to do by calling it truth is consecrate a higher poetry. The dark flame that Italian painters from Cimabue to Francesca have raised from the Tuscan landscape, as the lucid protestation of men thrown upon an earth whose splendor and light speak ceaselessly to them of a non-existent God. Sometimes indifference and insensitivity permit a face to merge with the mineral grandeur of a landscape. Just as certain Spanish peasants come to resemble their own olive trees, so the faces in Giotto's pictures, shorn of the insignificant shadows that reveal the soul, finally merge with Tuscany itself in the only lesson it freely offers, the exercise of passion at the expense of feeling, a mixture of asceticism and pleasure, a resonance common to both man and the earth, and by which man, like the earth, defines himself as halfway between wretchedness and love. There are not many truths the heart can be sure of. I realized this one evening as the shadows were beginning to drown the vines and olive trees of the Florentine countryside in a vast and silent sadness. But sadness in this country is never anything but a commentary on beauty. And as the train traveled on through the evening, I felt a tension in me, slowly relaxing. Can I doubt today that even with the face of sadness, one could call it happiness? Yes. Italy also lavishes on every landscape the lesson illustrated by its men. But it is easy to miss our chance of happiness, for it is always undeserved. The same is true of Italy, and if its grace is sudden, it is not always immediate. More than any other country, Italy invites us to deepen an experience that paradoxically seems to be complete on first acquaintance. This is because it begins by pouring out its poetry the better to disguise its truth. Italy's first enchantments are rites of forgetfulness, the laurel roses of Monaco, flower-filled Genoa with its smell of fish, and blue evenings on the Ligurian coast. Then finally Pisa, and with it an Italy, which has lost the rather tawdry charm of the Riviera. But it is still a land of easy virtue. So why not lend ourselves for a time to its sensual grace? There is nothing urging me on while I'm here. I am deprived of the joys of the harried tourist, since a cheap ticket compels me to spend a certain time in the town of my choice. My patience for love and understanding seems endless on this first evening when, dead tired and starved, I enter Pisa, greeted on the station platform by 10 loudspeakers bellowing out a flood of sentimental songs to an almost entirely youthful crowd. I already know what I expect. After the life here has surged around me, the strange moment will come when, with the cafes closed and the silence suddenly restored, I'll walk through the short, dark streets toward the center of the town. The black and gold Arno, the green and yellow monuments, the empty town. How can I describe the neat and sudden subterfuge that transforms Pisa, at 10 each evening, into a strange stage set of silence, water, and stone? In such a night as this, Jessica, here on this unique stage, gods appear with the voices of Shakespeare's lovers. We must learn how to lend ourselves to dreaming when dreams lend themselves to us. Already I can hear in the depth of this Italian night the strains of the more private song that people come to look for here. Tomorrow, and only tomorrow, the countryside will round out in the morning light. Tonight, I am a god among gods, and as Jessica flies off on the swift steps of love, I mingle my voice with Lorenzo's. But Jessica is only a pretext. This surge of love goes beyond her. Yes, I think Lorenzo is not so much in love with her as grateful to her for allowing him to love. Why should I dream this evening of the lovers of Venice and forget Verona's? Because there is nothing here that invites us to cherish unhappy lovers. Nothing is more vain than to die for love. What we ought to do is live. A living Lorenzo is better than a Romeo in his grave, despite his rosebush. Then why not dance in these celebrations of living love, and sleep in the afternoons, on the lawn of the Piazza del Duomo? Surrounded by monuments, there will always be time enough to visit, drink from the city's fountains where the water is lukewarm but so fluid, and look once more for the face of that laughing woman with the long nose and proud mouth. All we need understand is that this initiation prepares us for higher illuminations. These are the dazzling processions that lead to the Dionysian mysteries at Eleusis. It is in joy that man prepares his lessons, and when his ecstasy is at its highest pitch, that the flesh becomes conscious and consecrates its communion with a sacred mystery whose symbol is black blood. It is now that the self-forgetfulness drawn from the ardor of that first Italy prepares us for the lesson that frees us from hope and from our history. These twin truths of the body and of the moment, at the spectacle of beauty. How can we not cling to them as to the only happiness we can expect, one that will enchant us, but at the same time perish? The most loathsome materialism is not the kind people usually think of, but the sort that attempts to let dead ideas pass for living realities, diverting into sterile myths the stubborn and lucid attention we give to what we have within us that must forever die. I remember that in Florence, in the cloister of the dead, at the Santissima Annunziata, I was carried away by something I mistook for distress, which was only anger. It was raining. I was reading the inscriptions on the tombstones and ex-votos. One man had been a tender father and a faithful husband. Another, at the same time, the best of husbands and a skillful merchant. A young woman, a model of all the virtues, had spoken French, si come il nativo. There was a young girl who had been the hope of her whole family, ma la gioia e pellegrina sulla terra. None of this affected me. Nearly all of them, according to the inscriptions, had resigned themselves to dying, doubtless because they accepted their other duties. Children had invaded the cloister and were playing leapfrog over the tombstones that strove to perpetuate their virtues. Night was falling, and I had sat down on the ground, my back against a column. A priest smiled at me as he went by. In the church, an organ was playing softly, and the warm color of its pattern sometimes emerged behind the children's shouts. Alone against the column, I was like someone seized by the throat, who shouts out his faith as if it were his last word. Everything in me protested against such a resignation. "You must," said the inscriptions. But no, and my revolt was right. This joy that was moving forward, indifferent and absorbed like a pilgrim treading on the earth, was something that I had to follow step by step. And, as to the rest, I said no. I said no with all my strength. The tombstones were teaching me that it was pointless, that life is col sol levante, col sol cadente. But even today, I cannot see what my revolt loses by being pointless, and I am well aware of what it gains. Besides, that is not what I set out to say. I would like to define a little more clearly a truth I felt then, at the very heart of my revolt, and of which this revolt was only an extension. A truth that stretched from the tiny last roses in the cloister of Santa Maria Novella to the women on that Sunday morning in Florence, their breasts free beneath their light dresses and their moist lips. On every church corner that Sunday morning, there were displays of flowers, their petals thick and shining, bejeweled with spots of water. I found in them then a kind of simplicity, as well as a reward. There was a generous opulence in the flowers and in the women, and I could not see that desiring the latter was much different from longing for the former. The same pure heart sufficed for both. It's not often a man feels his heart is pure, but when he does, it is his duty to call what has so singularly purified him truth, even if this truth may seem a blasphemy to others, as is the case with what I thought that day. I had spent the morning in a Franciscan convent at Fiesole, full of the scent of laurel. I had stood for a long time in a little courtyard overflowing with red flowers, sunlight, and black and yellow bees. In one corner there was a green watering can. Earlier, I had visited the monks' cells and seen their little tables, each adorned with a skull. Now the garden testified to their inspiration. I had turned back toward Florence, down the hill that led toward the town, lying open with all its cypress trees. I felt this splendor of the world, the women and the flowers, was a kind of justification for these men. I was not sure that they were not also the justification for all men who know that an extreme level of poverty always meets the wealth and luxury of the world. Between the life of these Franciscans, enclosed among columns and flowers, and the life of the young men of the Padovani beach in Algiers who spend the whole year in the sun, I felt there was a common resonance. If they strip themselves bare, it is for a greater life, and not for another life. At least that is the only valid meaning of such expressions as deprivation and stripping oneself bare. Being naked always carries a sense of physical liberty and of the harmony between hand and flowers, the loving understanding between the earth and a man delivered from the human. Ah, I would be a convert if this were not already my religion. No, what I have just said cannot be a blasphemy, any more than if I say that the inner smile of Giotto's portraits of St. Francis justifies those who have a taste for happiness. For myths are to religion what poetry is to truth, ridiculous masks laid upon the passion to live. Shall I go further? The same men at Fiesole who live among red flowers keep in their cells the skull that nourishes their meditations. Florence at their windows and death on their tables. A certain continuity in despair can give birth to joy. And when life reaches a certain temperature, our soul and our blood mingle and live at ease in contradiction, as indifferent to duty as to faith. I am no longer surprised that a cheerful hand should thus have summarized its strange notion of honor on a wall in Pisa. Alberto fa l'amore con la mia sorella. I am no longer surprised that Italy should be the land of incests, or at least, what is more significant, of admitted incests. For the path that leads from beauty to immorality is tortuous but certain. Plunged deep in beauty, the mind feeds off nothingness. When a man faces landscapes whose grandeur clutches him by the throat, each movement of his mind is a scratch on his perfection. And soon, crossed out, scarred and rescarred by so many overwhelming certainties, man ceases to be anything at all in face of the world, but a formless stain, knowing only passive truths, the world's color or its sun. Landscapes as pure as this dry up the soul, and their beauty is unbearable. The message of these gospels of stone, sky, and water is that there are no resurrections. Henceforth, from the depths of the deserts that the heart sees as magnificent, men of these countries begin to feel temptation. Why is it surprising if minds brought up before the spectacle of nobility, in the rarefied air of beauty, remain unconvinced that greatness and goodness can live in harmony? An intelligence with no God to crown its glory seeks for a God in what denies it. Borgia, on his arrival in the Vatican, exclaims, "Now that God has given us the papacy, let us hasten to enjoy it." And he behaves accordingly. Hasten is indeed the word. There is already a hint of the despair so characteristic of people who have everything. Perhaps I am mistaken, for I was in fact happy in Florence, like many others before me. But what is happiness except the simple harmony between a man and the life he leads? And what more legitimate harmony can unite a man with life than the dual consciousness of his longing to endure and his awareness of death? At least he learns to count on nothing, and to see the present as the only truth given to us as a bonus. I realize that people talk about Italy, the Mediterranean, as classical countries where everything is on a human scale. But where is this? And where is the road that leads the way? Let me open my eyes to seek my measure and my satisfaction. What I see is Fiesole, Jamila, and ports in the sunlight. The human scale? Silence and dead stones. All the rest belongs to history, and yet this is not the end. For no one has said that happiness should be forever inseparable from optimism. It is linked to love, which is not the same thing. And I know of times and places where happiness can seem so bitter that we prefer the promise of it. But this is because at such times or places I had not heart enough to love. That is, to persevere in love. What we must talk of here is man's entry into the celebration of beauty and the earth. For now, like the neophyte shedding his last veils, he surrenders to his God the small change of his personality. Yes, there is a higher happiness, where happiness seems trivial. In Florence, I climbed right to the top of the Boboli Gardens, to a terrace from which I could see Mount Oliveto and the upper part of the town as far as the horizon. On each of the hills, the olive trees were pale as little wisps of smoke, and the stronger shoots of the cypresses stood out against their light mist, the nearer ones green and the further ones black. Heavy clouds spotted the deep blue of the sky. As the afternoon drew to a close, a silvery light bathed everything in silence. At first, the hilltops had been hidden in clouds, but a breeze had risen, whose breath I could feel on my cheek. As it blew, the clouds behind the mountains drew apart, like two sides of a curtain. At the same time, the cypress trees on the summit seemed to shoot up in a single jet against the sudden blue of the sky. With them, the whole hillside and landscape of stones and olive trees rose slowly back into sight. Other clouds appeared, the curtain closed, and the hill with its cypress trees and houses vanished once more. Then, the same breeze, which was closing the thick folds of the curtain over other hills, scarcely visible in the distance, came and pulled them open here anew. As the world thus filled and emptied its lungs, the same breath ended a few seconds away, and then, a little further off, took up again the theme of a fugue that stone and air were playing on a world scale. Each time, the theme was repeated in a slightly lower key. As I followed it into the distance, I became a little calmer, reaching the end of so stirring a vision. With one final glance, I took in the whole range of hills, breathing in unison as they slipped away, as if in some song of the entire earth. Millions of eyes, I knew, had gazed at this landscape, and for me it was like the first smile of the sky. It took me out of myself in the deepest sense of the word. It assured me that but for my love and the wondrous cry of these stones, there was no meaning in anything. The world is beautiful, and outside it, there is no salvation. The great truth that it patiently taught me is that the mind is nothing, nor even the heart, and that the stone warmed by the sun or the cypress tree shooting up against the suddenly clear sky mark the limits of the only universe in which being right is meaningful, nature without men. And this world annihilates me. It carries me to the end. It denies me without anger. As that evening fell over Florence, I was moving toward a wisdom where everything had already been overcome, except that tears came into my eyes, and a great sob of poetry welling up within me made me forget the world's truth. It is on this moment of balance I must end. The strange moment when spirituality rejects ethics, when happiness springs from the absence of hope, when the mind finds its justification in the body. If it is true that every truth carries its bitterness within, it's also true that every denial contains a flourish of affirmations. And this song of hopeless love, born in contemplation, may also seem the most effective guide for action. As he emerges from the tomb, the risen Christ of Piero della Francesca has no human expression on his face, only a fierce and soulless grandeur that I cannot help taking for a resolve to live. For the wise man, like the idiot, expresses little. The reversion delights me. But do I owe this lesson to Italy, or have I drawn it from my own heart? It was surely in Italy that I became aware of it. But this is because Italy, like other privileged places, offers me the spectacle of a beauty, in which nonetheless, men die. Here again, truth must decay. And what is more exalting? Even if I long for it, what have I in common with a truth that is not destined to decay? It is not on my scale, and to love it would be pretense. People rarely understand that it is never through despair that a man gives up what constituted his life. Impulses and moments of despair lead toward other lives and merely indicate a quivering attachment to the lessons of the earth. But it can happen that when he reaches a certain degree of lucidity, a man feels his heart is closed, and without protest or rebellion, turns his back on what up to then he had taken for his life. That is to say, his restlessness. If Rimbaud dies in Abyssinia without having written a single line, it is not because he prefers adventure or has renounced literature. It is because that's how things are, and because when we reach a certain stage of awareness, we finally acknowledge something which each of us, according to our particular vocation, seeks not to understand. This clearly involves undertaking the survey of a certain desert. But this strange desert is accessible only to those who can live there in the full anguish of their thirst. Then, and only then, is it peopled with the living waters of happiness. Within reach of my hand, in the Boboli Gardens, hung enormous golden Chinese persimmons whose bursting skin oozed a thick syrup. Between this light hill and these juicy fruits, between the secret brotherhood linking me to the world and the hunger, urging me to seize the orange-colored flesh above my hand, I could feel the tension that leads certain men from asceticism to sensual delights, and from self-denial to the fullness of desire. I used to wonder, I still wonder, at this bond that unites man with the world, this double image in which my heart can intervene and dictate its happiness up to the precise limit where the world can either fulfill or destroy it. Florence. One of the few places in Europe where I've understood that at the heart of my revolt, consent is dormant. In its sky mingled with tears and sunlight, I learned to consent to the earth and be consumed in the dark flame of its celebrations. I felt, but what word can I use? What excess? How can one consecrate the harmony of love and revolt? The earth. In this great temple deserted by the gods, all my idols have feet of clay.